Jared's writing on birds and culture has been published in Audubon, the Center for Humans and Nature, and The Conversation. You can visit his website at thelonesomewhippoorwill.com for more about his forthcoming book on whippoorwills. Based on his research for that book, uh, Jared is going to take us behind the scenes of legend, lore, and the lives America's nightjars. By relearning these, Jared Del Rosso hopes we might deepen our connections to local landscapes, cultural histories, and this threatened family of birds. And so I want to turn it over now to Jared to share his thoughts on the American goatsuckers, legend, lore, and the lives of our nightjars. During this session, we'll ask you to hold your questions. You can put them in the chat, and at the end of the presentation, I'll feed your questions to Jared to answer. And with that, it's all yours, Jared.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Colorado Field Ornithologist, for having me tonight. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my PowerPoint screen with you all. And then I'll do a little bit of an intro, and then we'll kind of get right to it. Again, thank you all for having me tonight. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to bring my work to Colorado Field Ornithologists. I started birding in 2012, just a few months before I moved to Denver to take the job that my new job at the University of Denver. And I really do mean it when I say that. I think it's only with the kind of the support, the knowledge, the thoughtfulness and the creativity of the Colorado birding community that this book became something that I thought would be possible, and something that I'm writing, and something that I'm bringing to now the Colorado birding community. So I appreciate this opportunity. Just a little bit of context, and then I will get into the presentation. I am a cultural sociologist, not a biologist, not an ornithologist, though I will share with you some of the biology and the ornithology surrounding U.S. nightjars, particularly, but not exclusively, the eastern whippoorwill. As a cultural sociologist, I'm drawn to this family of birds for the richness of the stories and the meanings and kind of the cultural lives of this family, and again, especially the eastern whippoorwill. They are also my favorite family of birds as a birder. Every spring, I go listening for common poorwills in kind of scrub oak thickets outside of Denver, and then I look for migrating flocks of common nighthawks as they begin to appear over my home. And so part of this work is to pay homage to this family of birds in the way that I can as a sociologist, by telling the stories around them. The book is just over half written. I've written or drafted 5 of 7 chapters. I hope to finish it in the next several months, maybe by the end of the year, and hope, fingers crossed, it'll be in print in 2016. It's under contract with New York University Press for their Animals in Context series. So eventually more info will be on NYU Press's website. For now, you can visit my website. The address is on the page if you want to know more. I have a monthly newsletter that I put out around the time of the full moon for reasons that will become clearer as we go, if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with this work. So with that, I want to start with this family of birds. I want to introduce you first to the family at large, give you a sense of who they are. I'm going to start with what is perhaps best known about this family, and that is that they have an odd and unusual, a famous and infamous really set of names, actually. As many of you probably are aware, this name goatsucker, which the nightjars are also known by, comes from a kind of misunderstanding of the bird. They were once believed in Europe, the Eurasian nightjar was, they were once believed to suckle goats at night and blind goats in the process. You might know that, you probably know that. You might know that Aristotle offers us the oldest record of this name in his History of Animals, which was written in 350 BC, although it probably came before that even. Less well known is that there are other associations with domestic animals. So, for instance, there was a belief in southern England in the 18th century that nightjars would strike young cattle with their beaks and infect them with a disease that was called puckerage. And indeed, the birds were sometimes referred to as puckerage. In fact, Obviously, all of these stories are untrue. Nightjars are insectivores. They don't attack mammals. They have small and fairly weak beaks to begin with, so piercing the skin of cattle is impossible. And in the case of puckerage, what was actually happening was a parasitic fly was laying eggs beneath the skin of calves, and the larvae were burrowing into animals. Though this is all really a misunderstanding, the name goatsucker stuck around, as I'll show you in a moment. And there may also be a kernel of truth in these beliefs, and that is nightjars are almost exclusively insectivores. And generally speaking, they feed on flying insects. And what do flying insects like? They like domestic cattle. They like domestic goats. And so it was probably the case that historically people were indeed seeing these birds flying in the kind of erratic, shadowy way that these birds fly around the animals that they became associated with. These are old beliefs, but the name goatsucker has stuck around. It's also embedded in the scientific name for the family, which links the Latin word for goat with the Latin word to milk. And so the Eurasian nightjar and the beliefs around it, in a sense, have been globalized around this family of birds. It's not, however, just in the goatsucker lore, the nightjar, or excuse me, the goatsucker lore and that name that the Eurasian nightjar has given meaning to this family. For the longest time, I hadn't given thought to the common name for this family of birds. Again, the global English language common name for this family of birds, nightjar. When I began to give it any kind of thought, I came up with a really wrong understanding of why they would be called nightjars. Night, obviously, because they have an association with night. They're crepuscular and nocturnal. And I convinced myself they were called jars because they're kind of roughly shaped like a clay bowl inverted on the soil. And I said, that's close to a jar. Maybe they're called nightjars for that reason. In fact, the word jar here is referring to the call of the Eurasian nightjar. So again, the common language name, or the common name for this family of birds, is coming from this single species. So jar here meaning a harsh, inharmonious sound or combination of sounds. This bird has also been called chur owl, eve-chur, night-chur, and jar owl, other evocative names that get at the nocturnal nature of the bird and its song. Chur here meaning a deep or low-trilled whirring sound given by some birds. And so this bird's song, which is not actually representative of all songs in this family, whippoorwills, for instance, porwills, for instance, and others, have kind of a harmonious whistling song. But this song gave the whole family its name. So I want to play that for you. It is jarring. It is churring. It is all that the name kind of suggests. So I'll play that for you for a moment here. Also described as a mechanical or insect-like trill is the song of the Eurasian nightjar. Here in the US, there are 8 species of nightjars, and only about 50% have been documented in Colorado, just over. But in terms of breeding birds, of course, the common nighthawk is our widespread breeder across the US and across Colorado. The common porwell, with its scientific name meaning moth-like plumage, is also a breeder in Colorado. And the lesser nighthawk has been documented in breeding bird surveys in Colorado as a probable nester in Montrose County, but it is by no means widespread, by no means common. And so if you're out there birding in the spring, summer, and fall, and you see a nightjar, very likely it's a common porwell or a common nighthawk. Eastern and Mexican whippoorwills, which were as recently as like a decade and a few years ago, a single species, have both been documented in the state. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these species, and I want to do so, though, and some of the natural history surrounding this family, through a belief I have about nightjars, which is that every single nightjar has a superpower. In fact, I kind of believe every species has a superpower, something that makes them unique, something that makes them very well suited to the habitats that they choose to live in. And of course, a generalist species like a crow is going to have a very different superpower or set of new superpowers than or a more niche type species, as most nightjars are. But I want to start with something that virtually all the nightjars share as a superpower, which is deception. Among birds, they have some of the most remarkably cryptic plumage. They also have a set of behaviors that they use to ward off threats, even though as a bird, they're not remarkably quick, they're not remarkably strong in terms of their relationships with predators. So they're reliant on deception. And I want to share that with you because it's something that really makes this family special. I'll illustrate that through a bird that's not present in the US, the freckled nightjar. I was looking through iNaturalist or I think actually Flickr for nightjar photos. And I wanted one that really captures the richness and the incredibly perfected two habitat type plumage of nightjars. And this photograph really did it for me, because this bird in the front here, it's difficult to tell where they end and the landscape begins. And the dark coloring of the soil marks the dark coloring of their feathering. And what I think are like silverish green lichens or flecks of other kinds of minerals on the soil, though I do think they're lichens, matches almost perfectly the light greenish gray plumage of these birds. And so the cryptic nature of their plumage, the complexity of their plumage is really something that sets this family apart. And again, among birds, they have some of the most remarkably cryptic plumage. So much so that we really have to search deep in the English language to be able to describe nightjar feathering. A favorite word of D.T. Holyoake, who's written one of the early kind of encyclopedic books on nightjars, is vermiculate, which I'll define in a moment. But you should know this is an incredibly rare bird. I think it's actually easier to encounter and visually spot a nightjar than it is to encounter this word vermiculate. The Oxford English Dictionary tells us you'd have to read about 40 million words to encounter vermiculate once, unless, of course, you're reading Holyoake's book, because he's using it over and over in his species account. It means marked with irregular lines, and I'll show you that. And as a word, that would be, that's not particularly remarkable, but it has another really rich meaning that is suiting the nightjar family really well. Worm-eaten. For a family of birds with really evocative name, chur-owl, nightjar, whippoorwill, chuck-will's widow, poor-will, nighthawk, among others, the fact that you can't describe their feathering without relying on a word, in the case of whippoorwills, which really tells you something about their habitats. This is a bird that lives and breeds and nests and raises its young on the forest floors of the eastern US amid rotting wood, rotting leaf litter, really among the places where you're going to see these worm-eaten spaces. To give you a sense of what whippoorwill plumage looks like, and what nightjar plumage, how it kind of has this vermiculate effect. Here are some primary wing feathers from the feather atlas. For this audience, I wanted to pull a poor-will feathering, but unfortunately, the feather atlas is kind of indefinitely down for maintenance, so I couldn't get to that photo. At first glance, these photos look pretty much like, you know, maybe an owl or hawk feather, but when you really zoom in, you can see these this vermiculate markings, these worm-eaten paths through these splotches of orange that gives this effect for whippoorwills. I'm incredibly impressed by whippoorwill plumage, nightjar plumage generally, but whippoorwill plumage in particular. Whippoorwills, Eastern and Mexican, are just two of the three extant species in the US, represented by more audio recordings in the Macaulay Library that Cornell operates than photographs. The vast majority of birds are far more commonly photographed than we have audio recordings of them, except for Eastern and Mexican whippoorwills and the black rail. So that in itself is remarkable. People are only really hearing this bird, very rarely seeing this bird. But what makes nightjars really special to me in terms of their feathering, what makes whippoorwills really special to me, is it's almost impossible to describe a nightjar or describe a whippoorwill in a way that allows you to actually picture the bird. Their feathering is so complex, their matching of their habitats is so perfect that you really can't put into language what this bird means. So in my book, I write of this with the reference to the Birds of the World account, the kind of definitive account that we have access to through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And I'm just going to read a brief paragraph from my book. So it's nearly impossible to call up an image of a whippoorwill from a description of a whippoorwill. The upper parts of whippoorwills are, according to the Birds of the World account, minutely speckled brown and streaked blackish brown. There is and I'm quoting here, an irregular central stripe of black down the back of whippoorwills. This is an account of just over 300 words. And in just over 300 words, you have this great pile of descriptive words that appear often multiple times to characterize the pattern, or really just try to characterize the pattern of a whippoorwill. Speckled, freckled, flecked, irregular, indistinct, streaked, spotted, scalloped, and barred. All of these words to try to communicate to you what these feathers look like. Ish, as in brownish, blackish, whitish, grayish, appears 16 times. The bird almost doesn't want to commit to any one color in its feathering. It's always brownish, blackish, whitish, grayish. Here you also see orange-ish in their feathering. Nightjars and whippoorwills need this plumage for a number of different reasons. One is that they hold still during the day, usually on a branch or even on the ground itself. They are vulnerable to predators because of that, but also because their young are incredibly vulnerable to predation. Their eggs, these are whippoorwill eggs, and young birds, this is an incredible photograph of whippoorwill chicks by Mike Akrish in Massachusetts. Their eggs and their young are just about the only thing about these birds that look like what we picture when we picture birds. Eggs and young chicks, like backyard chickens almost. Incredible, they kind of jump out at you on the browns and greens of the habitats that they're in. And so being able to cover them up with the adult camouflage are incredibly important. But sometimes camouflage doesn't work. Sometimes there is a predator nearby. Sometimes a bird gets spotted. Sometimes an intruder inadvertently kind of creeps up to a bird resting on the ground during the day, or maybe roosting or brooding during the evening. In that case, deception is still the superpower, but it transforms from the deception of camouflage and blending in to the deception of bluffing. Nightjars are not incredibly powerful birds from the perspective of a predator. I mean, maybe to a flying insect they are, but they've got very small, relatively weak beaks, relatively small legs. They kind of waddle rather than run. Most of them don't flock, so they can't do a kind of mobbing-like behavior. And so they're reliant on looking like a threat, even when they're not actually a literal threat. I'm going to start with a couple of videos here to demonstrate these kinds of behaviors: threat displays, lunges, vocal threatening, the use of vocal behavior to threaten a potential intruder. Here we have a video taken of a white-tailed deer approaching a whippoorwill. White-tailed deers are kind of like a surprising threat to eastern whippoorwills. On one hand, they alter forest structures. They do this by grazing, and in many places in the east, they're also considered kind of overpopulated and overgrazing. So they're kind of removing all the lower dimensions of a forest that a ground nester like a whippoorwill would need. But surprisingly, and I didn't know this till I started this project, surprisingly, white-tailed deers are occasionally opportunistically omnivorous. So they have been documented eating whippoorwill young, eating whippoorwill eggs when they come across them on a forest floor. I provided a little bit of an introduction here to give you a chance to look at the still of the opening of this video to see if you can spot the bird. Watch this spot to the right of the 2021. You've got the tail of the bird here. And you're going to see kind of a threat display of the bird as this white-tailed deer approaches it. Getting large, flying in the face of the deer, spreading its wings, spreading its tail, almost hovering to kind of look the part of a threat. As ground nesters, nightjars will also use, they will also feign injury like many ground nesters do. You might be most familiar with this with killdeer, but this is another one of these kind of deceptive displays, feigning injury to lead a potential predator away from young, away from eggs. But very quickly, nightjars develop the ability to engage in these kinds of threatening displays. They combine sounds, they combine getting large with a really impressive and frankly scary gape. They have incredibly large gapes. They can open their mouth incredibly wide to be able to swallow flying insects, usually flying insects, whole. I did some math at some point, and an eastern whippoorwill if it was the size of a 6 foot tall person, could open their mouth something like 9.5 inches, which is twice what the Guinness Book of World Record mouth is. They swallow proportionately, if they were 6 foot tall, the equivalent of like a 15-inch sandwich in a single gulp. These are birds with incredibly large mouths. And as young birds, they develop the ability to lunge and to look the part of a threat very early on. So here's a common nighthawk chick video recorded by Gretchen Newberry as part of her research into nighthawks. So I'll show you that video. You can hear that almost reptilian-like roar and that large gape opening and the bird lunging forward. And the birds develop the ability to do this at a relatively young age. And it's a fairly effective scare tactic to potential intruders. Here's a common porwell engaging in very similar behavior after being radio tagged by Kate Stone of MPG Ranch in Montana. Remember that bird's scientific name, moth-like plumage, but now the bird is large, taut. It very much looks the part of, I think, a dragon. And it's going to do that same lunging, kind of roaring type behavior with the gape open, hissing type behavior. A rather intimidating thing to come across. So they look the parts of threats when their incredibly cryptic plumage doesn't betray them, but when they can no longer stay camouflaged, they can look the part of a threat. That to me is one of the things that makes this family most remarkable. They are known through their songs and their calls because they are so rarely seen. And they have the superpower of camouflage. But in truth, I really believe that each species of this family has a second ability or superpower that really makes them special among nightjars. So we'll start here with the common nighthawk to bring this back to Colorado before we go back to eastern whippoorwills. This is a bird I photographed actually in Mississippi, not Colorado. It was perched on a tree for the better part of a day near the Mississippi River in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I lived part-time for a couple years. Common nighthawks' superpower, or kind of what makes them special among U.S. nightjars, is their incredible adaptability in nesting. So as early as 1869, they were adapting to nesting on gravel-covered roofs. And here you have a photograph, again, provided to me by Gretchen Newberry, who studied nest roofing nighthawks for her book, The Nighthawk's Evening. This is a behavior, again, initially documented in the late 19th century. The transition away from using gravel-covered roofs is one of the things that biologists have pointed to explain the decline in common nighthawk populations. Increasingly, we're not going through the effort of covering buildings with rocks. We're just using, I think, synthetic materials like plastic. But even as nighthawks use these spaces for nesting and continue to do so, it isn't an easy life. Nesting on a rooftop opens birds to predation, particularly from other birds, crows. In another surprising act of predation, Newberry has documented mourning doves, kind of like almost like the bird equivalent of white-tailed deers, generally thought of as these happy pacifists, almost as birds. She's documented mourning doves predating common nighthawk, I believe, eggs. They're vulnerable to human activity, particularly projectiles like fireworks and other things that can land on a roof. And of course, roofs are incredibly hot spaces to be nesting, particularly gravel-covered roofs are incredibly hot spaces, particularly amid climate change. So it's not an easy life, and losing chicks and failed nests are pretty common. And if you want to know more about this, please do check out Newberry's book. What's interesting to me, as someone interested in the kind of intersection between humans and animals, urban spaces and animals, this was the course Chuck was referencing, my course on urban wildlife that I teach in the springs at the University of Denver. Nighthawks aren't the only bird in this family to do this. In Taiwan, beginning around 2000, the Savannah nightjar was documented as beginning to nest on rooftops in urban centers in Taiwan, and this has spread over the last 25 years, such that the bird has gained a reputation for instigating, although that's not the direction of these kinds of conflicts, but instigating human-animal conflicts, because their call, which I'll play for you in a moment, is again really loud, really jarring, particularly from a building rooftop where it's going to maybe echo or reverberate. And so I've pulled some graphics from a public service announcement around the Savannah nightjar. So you've got like an image here on the left, basically showing the bird waking someone up. You've got an image on the right that's really about coexistence with the Savannah nightjar. It's recommending that if you want to avoid these kinds of encounters, use your space, use a rooftop for human activities because they won't nest there, or simply appreciate their song. Let me play that for you so you can get a sense of why this call might be so disruptive if it's happening outside a window that you're living on in an urban center, overnight especially. It almost quite literally sounds like an alarm call. Most of the time, we're hearing nightjars from a great distance, but their calls are incredibly loud. I had once the good fortune of encountering a common nighthawk perched on a tree in Cheeseman Park. I didn't know it was there till it let out one of the loudest calls I'd ever heard. And it stopped my dog in its tracks. It stopped me in my tracks. It was so incredibly loud that I can only really imagine what it's like to live next to a bird calling like this. To stick with Colorado for a little bit longer, the common poorwill is one of the most remarkable species of nightjars and simply of really any kind of birds. They're known as a bird of extremes. They're birds who can enter into extended periods of torpor for periods of 10 days. It's been documented up to 25 days where they drop their body temperatures to deal with the colds of fall and winter nights, but also spring nights, especially in the habitats that they're in. Other birds can enter into torpor overnight for hours at a time. But again, the common poorwill is the only bird known to do this for extended periods of time, such that it approximates a state like hibernation. But remarkably, they are also the most efficient birds at cooling themselves by evaporating water. So they can enter states of prolonged torpor. They also have an incredibly advanced air conditioning system for themselves. And like all nightjars, they have remarkable plumage. So I'm sure as birders, you've all picked out the common poorwill that I spotted in 2015 in Denver Botanic Gardens in this lovely shale garden. But if not, here's that bird. And you can kind of see how well it blends in to the shadows of the shale and the shale itself. All of this brings me to the bird I'm writing a book on, the Eastern whippoorwill. Some of these stories about these other nightjars figures in the book, but as a cultural sociologist, I'm drawn to the Eastern whippoorwill for a couple different reasons, one of which is the richness of the stories and kind of symbolism that this bird has carried for 200, 300, 400 years at least, given its prominent and well-known song and given its place on the Eastern landscape. I'll also say that I am my formative experiences with nature were in the Northeast of the United States. I never experienced an Eastern whippoorwill in my childhood, but I grew up in the kinds of spaces where this bird would have been present. So writing about this bird has been a way to reconnect with that kind of landscape. A brief introduction, then I'll get into the Eastern whippoorwill superpower. You've got the bird's range on the left-hand side here. You can see it breeds throughout much of the Eastern United States, up into New England, up into Southern Canada, actually drifting into kind of the southern portion of Central Canada. It overwinters in Central America, Mexico, along the Gulf, into Florida, Georgia, and up through the mid-Atlantic. And I looked at eBird this afternoon, and it's been reported now into kind of the middle of Georgia. It's crept up from kind of central Florida into Georgia over the last couple months. So I'm waiting to see this bird vicariously through eBird reports move up into its breeding range. It nests on forest floors of the eastern US. It's a little bit picky about the structure of the forests it needs. It likes extensive forest with what's called open canopy. So kind of disruptions to that extensive forest where it can hunt hunt bugs, insects, flying insects, large moths and large beetles at the edges of forested landscapes. And it, like the other nightjars, has its own superpower. It is lunarphilic. A lot of nightjars become more active under a full moon, but the whippoorwill seems to have taken this kind of to a degree that other birds have not yet been documented as taking this. So there's evidence that they can time their breeding to the cycles of the moon, such that some years their young will hatch a few days before the full moon. And I'll tell you why biologists think this is the case in a minute or two. A recent study found that there's evidence that northern populations of this bird, particularly in that spot that jaunts out into central Canada, can time their southward migration in autumn to the lunar cycle. These are insectivores, as I've said. They're vulnerable then to frost because their prey is vulnerable to frost. And this threat, of course, is highest in more northerly populations. And what the authors of this study found was that in more northern populations, when the full moon in September comes early in the month, the birds will stay through it and they'll hunt and they'll, fuel up before their fall migration south through that full moon. But when the full moon comes late and the threat of a frost is higher, they actually leave a few days before the full moon. And what the authors of this study speculate is that very likely what they're doing is they're trying to move south to get somewhere to feed really actively under that next full moon. Biologists hypothesize that because these are birds that hunt upward, and common poorwill are really similar in this as well. They hunt from the ground, they hunt from low perches, hunting up at flying insects. A bright moon, a lit sky is going to backlight their prey. So the young hatch a few days before a full moon, often in part so adults can feed them more vigorously when they're very young and really needing of food, and the same with that fall migration. The birds also really sing vigorously during a full moon. They sing for a much greater portion of the evening. They start competing with each other really vigorously, such that as a person writing about this bird, I've begun to align my own life with the moon cycle. So last March, I headed to Missouri to shadow some scientists studying the bird and essentially just experience it up close in a place where they were incredibly common. This is the Ozarks of southern Missouri. And so I'll play for you finally the call of the whippoorwill, the song that gives them their name, the song that shows up in country music, poetry, folklore, as you'll see in a moment. I want you to be able to hear this bird's call. So I'm going to play that for you for a moment here. Generally translated or represented as whippoorwill, some of our field guides will point out that middle sound or that middle syllable of pour, actually, if you listen carefully, you can hear two parts to it. So it's more like purr. And if you slow the call down to about 50%, it actually sounds like whip, pour, will, like it actually has 5 parts. So it's kind of compressed to our ears by its speed. It's that call, it's that song which has meant so much to so many people over the last several centuries, and certainly before that as well. And it's that call and its place in human activity and culture that I want to tell you about now. And I'm going to tell you about that through the first whippoorwill of the year. I'm going to tell you about some of the legend and lore that circulated around the first whippoorwill of the year. As birders, we like to look for our first of the year or our first of the season, but this is a long-standing kind of ritual or practice in indigenous and U.S. American culture. So I'm going to start this section with just a brief reading from my book, and I'm going to tell you about the person who wrote this letter to his daughter about the first whippoorwill of the year that he heard in New York City. Before he was the 3rd president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson spent much of the spring and summer of 1790 in New York City, then the capital of a young United States of America. He went there as the country's first Secretary of State. In his few short months in the city, Jefferson established the country's first patent office and negotiated the Compromise of 1790. Amid this, Thomas found time to write his daughter, Mary, keeping count of the letters he sent to those his obviously overwhelmed daughter penned in return. He writes, "You now owe me 4 in one late summer message, and I insist on you writing me one every week till you shall have paid the debt. I write to you every 3 weeks, and I think you have quite as little to do as I have, so that I may expect a letter for letter." In one of those letters, to which Mary didn't promptly reply, Thomas reported on the arrival of birds and the ripening of fruits in New York. "We had not peas nor strawberries here till the 8th day of June," he wrote. "And then on the same day," he says, "I heard the first whippoorwill. When had you peas, strawberries, and whippoorwills in Virginia? Take notice hereafter whether the whippoorwills always come with the strawberries and peas." Jefferson was engaging in what we call phenology, a kind of part science, part art of watching the world carefully and looking for signs, seasonal signs that kind of tell you what's going to happen next, what's going to happen next with the weather, with the climate, with other developments in the landscape, and with the biology of other species. In fact, he was probably off. To hear your first whippoorwill in early June in New York is rather late. The bird returns in April and May. He probably mistook his first whippoorwill of the year for the first whippoorwill of the year. So his phenology is probably not something we can rely on here in terms of the timing of strawberries and peas. And yet the bird has been incredibly important for generations to phenology. Most importantly, the year's first whippoorwill was an indicator that we had passed in most of the eastern US the risk of frost. As most of us in Colorado know that our last frosts are incredibly unpredictable. They can be April. The broad-tailed hummingbird could be the indicator. They could be late May. The common nighthawk could be the indicator. But in the eastern US, the song of a whippoorwill was the indicator of the last frost. This meant something really important in an agrarian society. It was time to plant frost-sensitive crops like corn and beans. This is a belief that early European naturalists attributed to Native Americans as early as 1778. And like that belief in the goatsucker, it probably was a long-standing, enduring belief. There were other things that kind of went hand in hand with the last frost and with these changes on the landscape. In some places, I've seen this in Missouri, in North Carolina, it was linked to the timing of letting cattle out to pasture. The idea being that the grains and grasses that cows fed on were robust enough to now feed them. There was folklore that it was time to go barefooted. When you heard your first whippoorwill of the year, spring had started. You could play outside. Children could play outside. Once they heard the first whippoorwill of the year, they could go barefoot. Some families started winding down their use of firewood. They stopped starting morning fires after they heard the year's first whippoorwill. No wonder that local communities in the US for much of the late 19th through the early to mid 20th centuries would anxiously await this bird, and they would share news of it in US newspapers. And that's kind of how I've uncovered some of these stories. You've got this example from 1886 in North Carolina, which tells you can turn your cows out to pasture, which reports, last Wednesday night, April 14th, we heard the first whippoorwill of the season, which is a sign that spring has opened and it's time to go barefooted. Watching or listening for waiting for whippoorwills, listening for whippoorwills, sharing about whippoorwills lasted into around the 1970s. The last place where I've really seen it or found it as kind of a regular activity is Logan, Ohio, where a trio of journalists in an increasingly suburban America were sharing news of people coming and going, friends and family visiting, alongside reports like this one. Mrs. Viola Wagner heard the first whippoorwill Tuesday evening, April 22nd. Logan, Ohio, though I've never visited, kind of has a special place in my heart for the commitment of these journalists sharing these communal stories about whippoorwills coming back to Logan, Ohio. But I'll also point out that there was a naturalist club called the Wheaton Club in the 1960s, which held maybe a regular or semi-regular event called a Whippoorwill Derby. This was an all men's nature group, and they would get together, in late May, early June, and they would all kind of make a a prediction of when that night's first whippoorwill would call. They were basing on this and their experience with the bird, things like weather, and then they would go out, wait, and listen and see who got it most close, who was best, most right in their prediction. I think this is a lovely activity, and perhaps Colorado birders will strike up poor-will derbies to reconnect with this bird. Other people developed really unique rituals around the year's first whippoorwill. This is one of my favorite. A man named R.H. Griggs of DeKalb County, Alabama, would get 2 haircuts a year. He would get his first when he heard the first whippoorwill sing. And then later in the year, when it was sorghum making time in the fall, he would get his second haircut. This brief little story about the man his friends called Uncle Rip kind of went viral by the standards of the 1940s. I found it in at least 27 newspapers, but probably it was reprinted more than that. This piece of kind of Americana so captured people's imagination for the relationship to the bird and, of course, the twice-a-year haircut ritual. There were other beliefs, legends, and lores that circulated around the year's first whippoorwill. There was some folk medicine, folk beliefs around the year's first whippoorwill that held that if you did 3 somersaults or you rolled on the ground 3 times, 3 is a long-standing magic number. That's why that number is important. You wouldn't have back pain all year. Of course, if at night on a just thawed ground near a forest, when you hear a bird, you're willing to do 3 somersaults or 3 rolls, probably you were not going to have back pain all the year. Anyway, I would never try this on my own. Wealth, if you had a pocket full or purse full of currency, of coins or bills, or the belief held if you shook your pocket or you shook your wallet or purse when you heard your first whippoorwill of the year, you were guaranteed to have money all year long. And there's a bird with a conspicuous, familiar, and well-known call, a call that could be counted. It also made predictions about life, love, and death. So the year's first whippoorwill for you could predict how many years you had to live based on the number of times it said its name. But if you were single, you could also count those names to predict how many years left you had of singlehood until marriage. I really want to emphasize that in belief, this only held with the year's first whippoorwill. The year's first whippoorwill could grant wishes, could grant wealth, could cure backaches. After that, the bird was often much feared. A whippoorwill singing near your home, under a bedroom window, on a doorstep, usually was an ill omen. It meant death. It meant illness. It was not a welcome sight or a welcome encounter. So this song was really only most anticipated when it was the first whippoorwill of the year. Which brings me to a kind of abrupt shift, a section and a chapter, in fact, of my book that I call The Last Whippoorwill: Birds and People, Birds and Us Amid Species Decline. Whippoorwills, like many species of birds, I'm sure you all know, have been declining at the level of a population over the last 50, 60, 70 years. So I've got a map up here that shows some of that data from the Breeding Bird Survey. Most of the states and Canadian provinces where the bird breeds are marked in red or orange, meaning a declining population. Some other numbers and figures to kind of characterize this decline. It's an estimated 2.76 annual decline, a roughly 70% population decline over about 45 years. The causes are multiple and currently being studied. This is an incredibly difficult family of bird to survey. Most breeding bird surveys don't really measure nightjars really accurately, but they do find the species, they do find this family of birds, and so the numbers are kind of a proxy for bird populations. And generally, there is a sense among people who watch and care for this bird that the species is declining. Some of the causes being identified are habitat loss, prey decline. These are birds that rely on really large, usually flying insects, which are also decreasing. Changes in forest structure is another potential cause of species decline. And if you all want to know more about that, I can talk about that afterward. This data from breeding bird surveys really only dates to about 1970, but I want to point out that people who watched and cared for this bird were seeing local level declines really early on. So in 1925, in the Wilson Bulletin, a naturalist named E.D. Nauman documented the decline of whippoorwills in the area he grew up in southern Iowa. He said this bird was relatively common, almost as common as robins, and in his youth. But returning to the space about 40 years later, he'd seen robin numbers explode and whippoorwills basically disappear from local landscapes. He pointed out that their breeding grounds had been turned into pastures for hogs and used for timber. So he's documenting local habitat loss. Fast forward about 30 years, and the journalist Lucy Templeton documents in the mid 1950s that the birds had disappeared from her community in an area west of Knoxville. Templeton kept a really popular column in the Knoxville News Sentinel for basically the first 50 years of the 20th century. Not exactly that, but nearly that. She deeply cared about whippoorwills and all kinds of things, natural, nature-based birds especially. She would share the legend, lore, and phonology of whippoorwills. And so their erasure from her local landscape in 1954 was kind of a harbinger of what suburban development was doing for the bird. And that's what she pointed out, that I think it was a thicket where the bird had nested previously had been cleared to continue developing the neighborhood. But it's not just naturalists who are documenting this loss, who are writing about this loss of a species. If you go onto YouTube, you can find the American Bird Conservancy's recordings of eastern whippoorwills. You'll also see that many people who comment on this recording are documenting or bearing witness to the loss they experience when the species has disappeared. So I've reproduced, or I've copied 3 of those comments. This made me want to cry. Nostalgia from when my great-grandparents lived on their farm in the country, and we'd sit and listen to them at night. Another commentator documents falling asleep to the sound every night, then suddenly never hearing one again. Another one writes, I haven't heard one of these songs since I was a boy 30 plus years ago. And these are 3 of the most upvoted comments on this recording. So it's naturalists, it's ornithologists, it's people who grew up with the birds. It's also American poets. So I'm going to just read to you a very short poem by Gabriel Dunsmith, a poem published in 2022 called Upon My Return to Appalachia, where ecological loss aligns with familial loss, aligns with social and cultural losses. So Dunsmith writes, there will be no sorghum in the valleys, no crawdads or whippoorwills in their hidden places, nor those stout beams of chestnut lining my grandparents' fence. The churches will stand empty by the roadsides. The blackberry brambles will sag with rotted fruits. The recipes will be forgotten, the hearth cold. There will just be the mountains, old and still, and the sound of someone wailing from the next ridge. These are emotions expressed in this poem, expressed in the things people are commenting online, like nostalgia, new ecological emotions, like we call it eco-grief or solastalgia, which is the pain of seeing one's home place radically altered by climate change or development that people are experiencing through the loss of the species of bird. I'll close with my own experience with whippoorwills, something that mixes species decline perhaps with a little bit of hope. I wanted to close with, again, another little reading from the draft of my book. I went in September of 2023 to try to hear whippoorwills. I ended up on this dead end, basically, like it's a circle right at the edge of a state forest. There's some like water access for the water company. There's transmission towers that you can kind of see cutting across this Google Earth image here. So I want to tell you about that experience and why I was there listening in September, not a good time to hear whippoorwills. The road led nowhere, and that was the point, that this dead end at a marsh, this murky edge to a state forest in the Hudson Valley of New York might sing. Transmission towers marked the frontier between wetlands and woods. Moths rushed my rental car's headlights. Stepping out, mosquitoes rushed me. I drove there alone after spending the previous evenings on suburban roadsides with my youngest brother. We listened for a pattern amid the early September songs of frogs and cicadas, barred owls, and passing traffic. If you have ever sought a bird, you know what hope can do. We deciphered every sound twisted by distance and tree cover through that hope. Our hands cupped to our ears, Whippoorwill, whippoorwill, whippoorwill. Distant dogs answered. Televisions too, but night after night, stop after stop, whippoorwills eluded us. The absence of the birds might only have been their late summer quiet. It was a quiet I knew to expect when planning a trip from Colorado, where the birds aren't, to New York, where they're supposed to be. Highly variable are whippoorwills in September, one conservationist told me. Unpredictable, warned another. Or else whippoorwills weren't there in the places I sought them. When spot after spot turned up silent, not truly silent, but absent of the sound, I traveled 1,800 miles to hear. I consulted the now decade-old maps in the New York State's Breeding Bird Atlas. Produced by the Department of Environmental Conservation, the maps show where volunteers documented nesting birds during 2 previous survey cycles. The first took place from 1980 to 1985, the second from 2000 to 2005. The survey spanned my own time in New York. A child of the 80s, I had ventured around a forested yard, exploring a modest nature trail we cleared in the woods behind our home. In 1999, I left the state for college, having neither heard nor heard of whippoorwills. In New York, whippoorwills were widespread in the 1980s. That decade's breeding bird atlas shows this. Potential nest sites dot much of the state. By contrast, the 2000 map looks unfinished. Vast parts of the state are simply blank. There's a cartography of loss as much as a map of nesting birds. Virtually undetected they are from the eastern edge of the state, where my youngest brother lived with his partner and young child. She had learned to imitate the bird's song, though she had not yet heard it. Missing they are from the southern tier, bordering Pennsylvania, where my mother-in-law grew up hearing the birds. And thinned out they are from the counties where I grew up, Sullivan and Orange counties, where the species holds on in protected forests and less densely settled mountainsides. These are places where the legend of whippoorwills was made. Washington Irving had the bird frighten Ichabod Crane in his 18th century ghost tale, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which was set in Tarrytown, New York. On the other side of the Hudson, John Burroughs counted what's thought to be the record in whippoorwill endurance, a bird repeating his name 1,088 times without a break. Today, to count a whippoorwill's call in the Hudson Valley, you have to drive nearly an hour away from Burroughs' cabin to Sterling Forest or Fawnstalk State Park. And even then, you might have to do what my brother and I tried, park on the side of a road and listen to the sound of passing cars. So now my hope to hear a whippoorwill had me swatting mosquitoes and admiring power lines on that dead-end road in early September 2023. Odd but not surprising to find myself there. The wetlands opened the forest. The transmission towers did the same, as the ground below them was kept clear of large trees. And what was I so stubbornly chasing? Not a life bird. Over the past decade, I had heard whippoorwills while birding in New York, but these were songs sung briefly, muffled by distance and the churring of traffic. They often ended with doubt. Was that indeed a whippoorwill? Had others heard what I heard? At the right place in the wrong season, I was after a song more definitive. Maybe I was chasing belief. I wanted a whippoorwill to convince me that the icon was still an icon. I wanted to hear what others had once heard, the incessant song, not a single call, the unmistakable song, not doubt amid decline. That hope, after about a week without the bird, brought me to that dead-end road. And here they were. I heard them finally, even before I quieted my car's engine. These whippoorwills asked nothing of me. I did not need to cut my ears and strain. They were out there, somewhere along the frontier where marsh met woods. They were close, and there were 2 of them. Their calls ran together, the phrase we use for it breaking down, not whippoorwill, but more than that. That's the end of the presentation part. If you want to know more about my work, you can check out the webpage. The QR code gets you there. You're welcome to email me if you want to share nightjar stories. I'd love to hear about your encounters. If you've grown up or lived or birded among whippoorwills, but certainly our birds too, the common poorwill and the common nighthawk. I love each and every nightjar story is really special to me. So I'll stop there. I will stop my share as well. I'm happy to answer whatever questions you have about the bird, about the culture, about the rituals, about the meanings surrounding these birds.
Thank you, Jared. That was fantastic. And one thing that we miss with our webinars is the applause, but that was a great presentation.
Thank you,
I
Chuck.
love the combination of of natural history and cultural history of the whippoorwills
Thank you.
and the nightjars. You mentioned earlier the expected publication of your book,
Yeah.
and that would be in
Think,
2026.
fingers crossed 2026. It takes about a year from submitting a full manuscript to publication. No promises, but that's my hope. That's my hope. That's my hope.
Excellent. Yeah. Do you have a publisher?
New York University Press.
Excellent. All right. We'll look forward to that. And somebody had asked to have your website posted in the chat. I've done that, and you
Thank
also
you.
had it on your final screen there.
Yep.
I have a question here from Beth Parton, who wants to know, can we create habitat for nightjars in our yards?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question because obviously creating rich habitat is really important. My backyard habitat is incredibly suburban. I am in the southern suburbs of Colorado, and I was thinking about this question a day or two ago. My sense is if you're in like a typical urban suburban environment, you're probably not creating habitat for nightjars, but you can, I think, you can contribute to at least supporting, especially common nighthawks during migration. They feed especially on flying ants in August and September. I've looked up, seen great flocks of them, and then I've looked down and I've seen the ants emerging. So having a really rich environment in your backyard with very low levels of turf, bare spots, stony spots, rocks, and native plants, native trees is incredibly important. If you live in the foothills, then you're in a very different kind of situation. And I'd encourage you to reach out to like the Colorado Native Plant Society or an organization called Wild One Front Range if you're thinking about doing some landscape work, because that's where, for instance, porwills can really be found. And they have some real specific habitat needs. I don't know that one backyard would do the trick. The biggest thing with them is planting. If you can plant some Gambel's oak, that's I think what a lot of our birds really love and need. So urban suburban habitat, not likely, but just supporting insects is a way of supporting birds. So no pesticide use too is another big one.
Thanks, Jared.
I will say very quickly, and I'll let you get to the other question. In the Northeast with whippoorwills, actually, there's a lot that can be done with them because so many people have forest, so many people own acreage with forest. There's a lot of private public partnerships that are working on trying to create richer mixes of young and old forest that support a lot of species of animals. So it's a little bit different with the whippoorwill.
Yeah. And Ann Donahue would like to know if you participate in the Nightjar survey project.
I've wanted to. I've had some disruptions to my kind of everyday life. I've been trying to find like a nice 10-mile long survey line where I could survey for maybe for porwil. I've not yet done it. I would like to, but maybe I can, if there's a free moment, I can try to get the link to that website, or maybe the person who asked that question can get us all that link so people can see where that is if you want to participate. That's a great way of getting data because, again, these birds are so underreported to begin with, maybe like not badly understood, but just I think most of us as birders don't encounter them as often as these birds are actually on the landscape. So getting out there, surveying, becoming aware of them is incredibly important. And the data really goes a long way.